The Black Chronicle, 178 Years of Unbroken Memory and Engineered Resistance, by Rue Mission. Introduction. This work is not a seasonal celebration. It is not a commemorative gesture confined to a calendar month. It is a structural act of remembrance. The Black Chronicle, 178 Years of Black History, published in 1999 by Malloyd Ben Wilson Jr., is not simply a compilation of events. It is an architectural record of survival, resistance, strategy, brilliance, and federal confrontation. Black history is not February. It is foundation. It is the understructure of American democracy. It is the pressure that forced constitutional amendments. It is the organizing that reshaped federal power. It is the intellect that challenged pseudoscience. It is the labor that built cities. It is the litigation that dismantled segregation. This project exists to restore sequence, to restore cause and effect, to restore the understanding that none of the freedoms currently enjoyed were granted voluntarily. They were engineered through disciplined coordination, economic leverage, intellectual rigor, and strategic confrontation. From slavery to Reconstruction, from Jim Crow to Brown, from Montgomery to Selma, each era represents not chaos, but calculated response. Each generation inherited obstruction and responded with design. The mission of this work is to honor Black History Month every day, not symbolically, but structurally, to study it as policy development, to study it as constitutional stress testing, to study it as civic engineering, because history without analysis becomes nostalgia. History with analysis becomes instruction. The Black Chronicle documents 178 years, not as isolated milestones, but as a continuous negotiation between power and participation, between exclusion and enforcement, between resistance and federal expansion. It shows how economic withdrawal can bend cities, how legal precision can dismantle doctrine, how media exposure can accelerate legislation. It reveals that change is not mystical, it is organized. To honor this history daily means to understand its mechanics, to understand leverage, to understand coalition building, to understand federal authority and its limits, to understand that citizenship must be defended generation after generation. This work stands as a living archive, not to romanticize struggle, but to decode it, not to repeat slogans, but to study systems, not to perform remembrance, but to operationalize it. Black history is not past tense. It is structural memory, and structural memory is power. Issue 1. The Founding Contradiction. Before protest, before civil rights, before boycotts, before court rulings, there was a bargain. And the bargain was made in 1776. A nation declared that all men are created equal, while nearly 1/5 of its population was enslaved. And that contradiction was not accidental. It was negotiated. During the Revolutionary War, enslaved Africans were not immediately freed in the name of liberty. They were calculated as military assets. In 1775, Lord Dunmore, the British governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation offering freedom to enslaved men who would fight for the crown, and suddenly, liberty became a recruitment strategy. Colonial leaders responded not with moral clarity, but with counter-offers. Black men were permitted to fight, in some colonies, not because equality was recognized, but because manpower was needed. When the Constitution was drafted in 1787, the contradiction hardened into law. The 3/5 compromise counted enslaved people as partial persons for representation while denying them rights. The Fugitive Slave Clause required escaped enslaved individuals to be returned. The slave trade was federally protected for 20 years. This was not oversight. This was structural engineering. Southern states made clear they would not ratify the Constitution without guarantees for slavery, and so the preservation of union was prioritized over universal liberty. By 1793, Eli Whitney's cotton gin transformed slavery from a declining institution into an economic engine. Cotton exports exploded. By 1860, cotton accounted for over half of American export revenue. The wealth of the young republic was not floating on abstract ideals. It was anchored in forced labor. Understand the pattern. Liberty was proclaimed publicly, while bondage was protected legally. Equality was written rhetorically, while inequality was embedded economically. This is the origin point of American racial tension. Not simply prejudice, but policy. Not simply hatred, but incentive. The founding contradiction created a nation that would spend the next century wrestling with a question it never fully answered at birth. Who is liberty actually for? And once a contradiction is written into the foundation of a system, every future conflict becomes an attempt to resolve it. Issue 1 is not about slavery alone. It is about a constitutional compromise that institutionalized inequality while proclaiming freedom. And that unresolved tension is the starting engine of every movement that follows.
Issue 2. The first Countervoices. After the Constitution sealed compromise into law, the response did not begin with riots. It began with ink. Issue 2 moves us into the late 18th and early 19th centuries, where the first organized Black intellectual resistance emerges, not as rebellion, but as argument. Benjamin Banneker publishes his almanac in 1793, not merely as a calendar of seasons, but as a mathematical rebuttal to claims of African inferiority. In correspondence with Thomas Jefferson, Banneker challenges the contradiction directly. How can a nation proclaim equality while sustaining bondage? This is not emotional outrage. This is rational confrontation. Prince Hall delivers charges to the African Grand Lodge in the 1790s, building independent Black institutional life when white institutions exclude participation. Churches, lodges, mutual aid societies, these become parallel civic structures. Richard Allen founds the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1816 after experiencing segregation within white Methodist congregations. When pushed to the margins, Black Americans begin constructing autonomous spaces. Anti-slavery writing expands. Pamphlets circulate. David Cooper's A Serious Address to the Rulers of America speaks directly to political power. The Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery formalizes organized advocacy. Early abolition is not yet mass movement. It is moral argumentation, strategic documentation, and legal petition. Fugitive slave cases intensify tension. The Fugitive Slave Act mechanisms begin developing through court practice long before the 1850 federal statute, reinforcing the reality that the state apparatus is actively protecting slave property claims. This is not regional misunderstanding. It is federal enforcement. The debates recorded in the Annals of Congress show slavery discussed openly as policy, not as peripheral issue. The system is aware of the contradiction and chooses preservation over resolution. Meanwhile, Black thinkers are already articulating counter-frameworks, dignity, citizenship, moral equality, institutional independence. Issue 2 reveals something critical. Resistance begins with literacy, organization, and institution building. Before marches, before mass protest, there were almanacs, sermons, addresses, petitions, and independent churches. The first phase of counterpower was intellectual sovereignty. If Issue 1 exposes the contradiction, Issue 2 introduces the counter-argument. The enslaved were not silent. They were calculating, writing, organizing, building. And once a population begins producing its own institutions and intellectual frameworks, it has begun the long process of shifting power from dependency to self-definition. The seed of organized resistance is planted here, not in violence, but in disciplined articulation. And that discipline will compound across every issue that follows.
Issue 3. When words turn to fire. If Issue 2 showed disciplined articulation, Issue 3 shows what happens when moral argument meets structural refusal. By the early 1800s, slavery is no longer a fragile compromise. It is a fortified economy. Cotton production has exploded. The domestic slave trade expands westward into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. Human beings are now moved internally as capital assets, and resistance escalates accordingly. In 1827, Freedom's Journal becomes the first black-owned and operated newspaper in the United States, declaring, "We wish to plead our own cause." That sentence alone signals a shift. Self-representation is no longer optional. It is essential. But printed words are not the only force building. In 1829, David Walker publishes Walker's Appeal, a document so incendiary Southern states outlaw its circulation. Walker does not beg for gradual reform. He indicts the hypocrisy of a Christian slaveholding republic and warns that continued oppression invites divine and earthly consequences. His pamphlet is smuggled into Southern ports, sewn into clothing, and hidden in ship cargo. This is information warfare before the term existed. 2 years later, in 1831, Nat Turner leads an armed rebellion in Virginia. Turner believes himself divinely chosen to break chains through violence. The rebellion is swiftly suppressed, but the aftermath is more telling than the event itself. Southern states respond not with introspection, but with harsher slave codes, literacy bans, and tightened surveillance. Fear becomes policy. Repression intensifies. Meanwhile, abolition expands in the North. William Lloyd Garrison publishes The Liberator in 1831, demanding immediate emancipation, not gradual compromise. Abolition societies multiply. Black and white activists collaborate, though not without tension. Frederick Douglass will soon rise as a formerly enslaved intellectual force. But even before him, black testimony is shaping the narrative. Slave narratives circulate. The humanity of the enslaved is documented in first-person accounts, dismantling pro-slavery propaganda piece by piece. The North is not innocent territory. As Leon Litwack documents, so-called free states still restrict black voting rights, employment, and mobility. Racism is national, not regional. Fugitive slave enforcement expands cooperation between states. The machinery of capture becomes more organized. Even before the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, legal precedent reinforces the idea that property rights outweigh human freedom. The nation is polarizing. Debate shifts from reform to irreconcilability. Issue 3 reveals a crucial turning point. Resistance is no longer confined to sermons and petitions.
It now exists in newspapers, underground distribution networks, armed revolt, abolitionist presses, and organized societies. The system responds with surveillance, censorship, and harsher law. Each action produces counteraction. Each tightening produces pushback. The contradiction is no longer theoretical. It is combustible. If Issue 1 established the constitutional flaw, and Issue 2 established intellectual counter-construction, Issue 3 marks the beginning of open confrontation. Words become weapons. Information becomes insurgent. Fear becomes legislative. The Republic is moving toward collision, not because resistance appeared suddenly, but because compromise has reached its moral limit.
Issue 4. The law becomes the weapon. By the time we reach the 1850s, the United States is no longer debating whether slavery is moral. It is engineering whether it can survive expansion. The Mexican-American War has delivered vast new Western territories, and the question is no longer abstract. Will these lands be slave or free? The Compromise of 1850 attempts to preserve balance, admitting California is free while strengthening the Fugitive Slave Act to appease the South. That trade reveals the structure clearly. Freedom in one region is purchased by enforcement in another. The new Fugitive Slave Act does not simply allow the capture of escaped enslaved people. It mandates citizen cooperation. Federal commissioners are financially incentivized to rule in favor of slaveholders. Alleged fugitives are denied jury trials. Testimony of the accused is inadmissible. The law transforms from a neutral framework into an enforcement mechanism for property claims over human beings. Northern resistance intensifies. Vigilance committees organize. The Underground Railroad expands its network through Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and into Canada. Harriet Tubman increases her missions southward. But every rescue sharpens Southern paranoia. Slave catchers operate in free states. Kidnapping of free black citizens becomes common under legal cover. The state now polices mobility with federal authority. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act introduces popular sovereignty, allowing settlers to vote on slavery's legality in new territories. On paper, this sounds democratic. In practice, it produces violence. Armed pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flood into Kansas. Ballot fraud, intimidation, and bloodshed follow. Bleeding Kansas is not metaphor. It is rehearsal. The myth of peaceful compromise disintegrates. Then comes 1857. Dred Scott versus Sanford. The Supreme Court rules that black people, whether enslaved or free, are not citizens and have no standing to sue in federal court. It further declares that Congress lacks authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. This is not a minor ruling. It is structural annihilation of constitutional protection. The court nationalizes vulnerability. The decision signals to slaveholders that expansion is legally defensible. It signals to abolitionists that the highest legal authority has chosen property over personhood. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 must be understood in this context. Brown believes legal mechanisms are exhausted. He attempts to ignite a slave insurrection by seizing a federal arsenal. The raid fails militarily, but succeeds symbolically. The South sees terrorism. The North sees martyrdom. Polarization is no longer sectional disagreement. It is psychological separation. Issue 4 demonstrates a turning point. The law, once claimed as neutral ground, is now openly weaponized to sustain an economic order.
Compromise no longer diffuses tension, it amplifies mistrust. The Supreme Court legitimizes expansion. Congress destabilizes territories. Federal enforcement criminalizes escape. The system is no longer strained. It is splitting. The Republic is approaching fracture not because of sudden passion, but because legal architecture has been bent beyond moral tolerance.
Issue 5. The fracture becomes war. By 1860, the machinery of compromise is exhausted. Abraham Lincoln's election does not create secession. It exposes how fragile the Union has already become. Southern states interpret his victory not as immediate abolition, but as containment of slavery's expansion. For a system built on territorial growth and political parity, containment equals eventual extinction. South Carolina secedes in December 1860. Within months, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas follow. They do not hide their reasoning. Their declaration cites slavery explicitly as foundational to their economic and social order. This is not abstract states' rights rhetoric. It is a defense of a labor system worth billions in contemporary dollars. When Confederate forces fire on Fort Sumter in April 1861, the fracture becomes kinetic. The Civil War is not merely North versus South. It is industrial capacity versus agrarian export economy, centralized governance versus decentralized sovereignty, free labor ideology versus slave labor dependency. The North mobilizes rail networks, manufacturing infrastructure, and a larger population base. The South mobilizes strategic defense, agricultural wealth, and internal lines of communication. But beneath battlefield tactics lies something more structural. The Confederacy is fighting to preserve property in people. The Union initially fights to preserve territorial integrity. Emancipation is not yet the declared war aim. As casualties mount, Antietam, Gettysburg, Shiloh, the cost of preservation escalates. In 1863, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, not as pure moral awakening, but as wartime strategy. It reframes the conflict internationally and allows black men to enlist in the Union Army. Nearly 180,000 black soldiers will serve, shifting manpower and moral narrative simultaneously. Their participation transforms the war from a conflict over union into a conflict over freedom's definition. By 1865, Confederate infrastructure is collapsing. Sherman's march to the sea demonstrates industrialized total war, rail lines destroyed, supply chains severed, psychological warfare deployed. Richmond falls. Robert E. Lee surrenders at Appomattox. Slavery, as a legal institution, collapses under military defeat. The 13th Amendment formally abolishes it. But abolition is subtraction, not construction. The war ends the ownership of bodies. It does not yet establish the security of citizenship. Issue 5 marks the shift from legal argument to battlefield resolution. 4 years. Over 600,000 dead. Entire regions economically shattered. The Confederacy defeated. Slavery abolished. But the deeper question remains unresolved. What replaces it? Emancipation removes chains, but it does not yet build protection. The fracture is sealed politically, but socially it remains raw. Reconstruction now begins, and with it, a new test. Can a nation built on compromise reconstruct on equality? Issue 6. Reconstruction. Promise under siege. The Civil War ends in 1865, but victory does not equal stability. The Confederacy collapses militarily. The question becomes whether it will collapse ideologically. 4 million formerly enslaved people now exist outside legal bondage, but freedom without infrastructure is vulnerability. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, except as punishment for crime. That clause will matter later. The 14th Amendment establishes birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment prohibits racial discrimination in voting. On paper, this is revolutionary constitutional transformation. For the first time, the federal government asserts that black citizenship is national, not conditional. The Freedmen's Bureau is established in 1865 to provide food, medical care, labor contract supervision, and education. Black communities begin building schools at extraordinary speed. Churches become political organizing centers. Within a few years, black men are elected to state legislatures, Congress, and local offices throughout the South. Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce serve in the U.S. Senate. Reconstruction governments rewrite state constitutions to expand public education and social services. This is not symbolic participation. It is structural governance. But resistance reorganizes. Southern legislatures immediately draft black codes to restrict labor mobility, criminalize vagrancy, and bind freedmen to plantation labor through fines and arrest. The loophole in the 13th Amendment becomes weaponized. Convict leasing emerges. Arrest becomes labor supply. Private companies lease incarcerated black men for mining, railroads, and agriculture. Mortality rates soar. It is slavery reconstructed through criminal law. Simultaneously, paramilitary groups form: the Ku Klux Klan, the White League, the Red Shirts. Violence is strategic. Intimidate voters, assassinate office holders, terrorize communities. Federal enforcement acts attempt to suppress the Klan, and for a brief moment, federal troops protect Reconstruction governments. But Northern political will erodes. Economic panic in 1873 shifts national attention. Fatigue replaces urgency. The Compromise of 1877 removes federal troops from the South in exchange for resolving a contested presidential election. Reconstruction effectively ends. Without federal enforcement, Southern states move rapidly to institutionalize segregation. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses. Voting rights are systematically dismantled. Jim Crow is not accidental. It is engineered. The Supreme Court assists through narrow interpretations of the 14th Amendment, and later through Plessy v. Ferguson's separate but equal doctrine. Issue 6 reveals a brutal pattern: constitutional promise followed by structural retreat. Freedom is declared, but enforcement is inconsistent. Citizenship is written, but protection is withdrawn. Reconstruction proves that legal transformation without sustained protection can be reversed through policy, violence, and judicial narrowing. The war ended slavery. Reconstruction attempted equality. Withdrawal enabled segregation. The cycle now shifts from open rebellion to legalized separation. Issue 7. Segregation engineered. Reconstruction did not fail in a vacuum. It was dismantled with precision. By the late 1870s and 1880s, Southern states began codifying racial separation, not as temporary disorder, but as permanent structure. This is not spontaneous prejudice. It is policy architecture. Rail cars, schools, hospitals, water fountains, cemeteries. Segregation is mapped physically into daily life. The goal is not simply separation, but hierarchy made routine. In 1896, the Supreme Court formalizes this through Plessy v. Ferguson, declaring separate but equal constitutional.
The phrase is surgical deception. Separate is measurable. Equal is unenforced. Facilities for black citizens are chronically underfunded. The court does not demand parity. It sanctifies division. Voting suppression becomes scientific. Poll taxes eliminate poor voters. Literacy tests are administered arbitrarily. Grandfather clauses exempt white voters from new requirements. Violence supplements policy. Between 1880 and 1930, thousands of black men and women are lynched. These are not random crimes. They are public spectacles designed to enforce racial obedience. Newspapers circulate fabricated accusations to justify mob violence. Economic competition is reframed as criminal threat. Fear is weaponized into social discipline. Convict leasing expands during this period. Black men arrested under vague charges, vagrancy, loitering, breach of labor contract, are leased to private companies for mining, logging, and railroad construction. Mortality rates in some camps exceed those of slavery. The system extracts labor while avoiding the long-term investment costs of ownership. It is efficiency through disposability. The 13th Amendment loophole becomes industrial practice. Economically, sharecropping binds freed families to land through debt cycles. Crop lien systems ensure that cotton, not autonomy, drives production. A bad harvest equals permanent obligation. The agricultural South reconstructs labor dependency without formal chains. Meanwhile, Northern industrial growth accelerates. The racial order of the South stabilizes through terror and law, while the nation's economic center of gravity shifts northward. But resistance does not vanish. Black communities build institutions, churches, mutual aid societies, schools, businesses. The Niagara movement emerges in the early 1900s, demanding full civil rights. Ida B. Wells documents lynching with investigative precision, exposing the lie of protecting white womanhood. W.E.B. Du Bois articulates the concept of double consciousness, the psychological fracture of being both American and excluded from American protection. Issue 7 reveals the blueprint phase of Jim Crow. Segregation is not accidental. It is engineered. Legal validation from the Supreme Court, economic manipulation through debt and incarceration, psychological enforcement through terror, and narrative control through media combine into a durable racial order. The war ended slavery. Reconstruction attempted citizenship. Jim Crow institutionalized hierarchy. The system is no longer unstable. It is codified.
Issue 8. Flight and Fire, The Great Migration and Red Summer. By the early 1900s, Jim Crow is no longer improvisational. It is stable. Segregation is normalized. Violence is predictable. Economic mobility in the rural South is mathematically constrained by debt, disenfranchisement, and terror. But history introduces a variable the architects did not fully control: labor demand. World War I reshapes the industrial North. European immigration slows dramatically. Northern factories need workers: steel, meatpacking, railroads, munitions. Labor shortages create opportunity. Beginning around 1915, black families begin leaving the South in large numbers. Not randomly, strategically. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, New York, Philadelphia. By 1930, over 1 million black Southerners have relocated northward. This is not simply migration. It is demographic disruption. The black press fuels this movement. Newspapers like the Chicago Defender circulate in Southern communities, publishing train schedules, job listings,
and first-hand accounts of northern wages. Information becomes mobility. Migration becomes leverage. Southern plantation owners suddenly face labor shortages. Wages must rise to retain workers. The system begins to feel strain. But northern cities are not neutral ground. Housing covenants restrict black residents to overcrowded neighborhoods. Redlining practices begin to emerge. White laborers fear wage competition. Tension builds in urban industrial centers. In 1919, that tension detonates. The Red Summer erupts across more than 24 cities: Chicago, Washington, D.C., Elaine, Arkansas, and others. Violence breaks out over labor disputes, housing proximity, and fabricated accusations. White mobs attack black neighborhoods. Black veterans, many freshly returned from fighting in World War I, fight back. That distinction matters. This is not the submissive rule South of earlier decades. Armed self-defense becomes visible. In Elaine, Arkansas, a massacre follows black sharecroppers attempting to organize for fair crop payments. Estimates of black deaths range into the hundreds. In Chicago, a black teenager's drowning after crossing an invisible racial boundary at a segregated beach triggers days of street fighting. Federal intervention is inconsistent. Protection is unreliable. The lesson becomes clear. Migration reduces Southern control, but does not eliminate national racism. At the same time, cultural transformation accelerates. Harlem becomes a center of artistic and intellectual output. The Harlem Renaissance emerges in the 1920s. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay. Jazz migrates north with people. The movement is not only geographic, it is cultural assertion. Identity shifts from imposed category to expressive force. Issue 8 marks a structural shift. Containment gives way to movement. Southern systems lose captive labor. Northern cities confront demographic change. Violence erupts not because black citizens are passive, but because they are mobile, vocal, organized, and increasingly armed with information. The migration fractures regional control. The Red Summer reveals that resistance is no longer isolated. It is urban, collective, and unwilling to retreat. The racial order is no longer geographically stable. It is now national.
Issue 9. Selective Relief. The New Deal and Federal Power. By the 1930s, the United States is no longer debating slavery or segregation. It is confronting economic collapse. The Great Depression devastates banks, farms, factories, and families across racial lines. Unemployment skyrockets. Breadlines stretch through northern cities and southern towns alike. Into this crisis steps Franklin D. Roosevelt with the New Deal, an unprecedented expansion of federal authority designed to stabilize capitalism itself. Social Security, unemployment insurance, labor protections, housing finance programs. The federal government now directly shapes economic survival. On the surface, this appears universal, but policy design reveals precision exclusions. The Social Security Act of 1935 excludes agricultural and domestic workers, categories that disproportionately include black laborers in the South. That exclusion is not accidental. Southern lawmakers demanded to preserve plantation labor hierarchies. Federal relief flows, but it flows unevenly. The National Labor Relations Act strengthens industrial unions in the North, yet many Southern industries remain hostile to black union participation. Housing becomes the most enduring mechanism. The Federal Housing Administration, FHA, and Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, begin underwriting mortgages and stabilizing neighborhoods. But they also institutionalize redlining, mapping communities by perceived financial risk.
Black neighborhoods are shaded red. Loans are denied. Investment is withheld. Meanwhile, white suburban development is subsidized. Wealth accumulates in appreciating home equity. Black communities are structurally locked out of the largest wealth-building program in American history. Yet resistance adapts. A. Philip Randolph threatens a mass march on Washington in 1941 to protest defense industry discrimination. The threat alone pressures Roosevelt to issue Executive Order 8802, establishing the Fair Employment Practices Committee, FEPC. This is leverage politics. The federal government responds not purely from moral awakening, but from strategic pressure during wartime mobilization. Labor demand once again becomes bargaining power. World War II further complicates the narrative. Black soldiers fight fascism abroad, while segregation persists at home. The Double V campaign, victory against tyranny overseas and racism domestically, emerges in the black press. Migration accelerates again as defense industries expand in northern and western cities. Demographics shift. Political influence expands. Issue 9 reveals a subtle transformation. Racial hierarchy no longer depends solely on open segregation. It embeds itself in economic design. Exclusions written into Social Security. Mortgage access shaped by red lines. Labor protections distributed unevenly. At the same time, strategic organizing proves effective. Randolph's pressure campaign shows federal action can be forced. The New Deal era demonstrates that federal power is expandable, but not automatically equitable. Policy can exclude quietly while appearing neutral. The architecture of inequality evolves from overt signage to financial mapping.
Issue 10. Cold War Democracy. Image versus Reality. By the mid-1940s, the United States is no longer just a nation. It is a global superpower locked in ideological rivalry with the Soviet Union. The battlefield is not only military, it is moral. Democracy versus communism. Freedom versus totalitarianism. And suddenly, American racial segregation becomes a geopolitical liability. Images of lynching, poll taxes, segregated buses, and housing discrimination circulate internationally. Soviet propaganda amplifies American hypocrisy. If the United States claims to lead the free world, it cannot visibly deny freedom to millions of its own citizens without weakening its global argument. Black veterans return from World War II unwilling to re-enter second-class citizenship. Having worn the uniform, having fought fascism, they demand structural inclusion. Organizations like the NAACP expand membership dramatically. Legal strategy intensifies. Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall systematically attack segregation through the courts, not emotionally, but architecturally. The approach is incremental. Graduate schools first, then professional schools, then broader educational access. The goal is not sudden explosion, but precedent stacking. In 1948, President Harry Truman issues Executive Order 9981, desegregating the armed forces. This is not spontaneous moral clarity. It is Cold War calculus combined with domestic pressure. A. Philip Randolph had again threatened mass protest over discrimination in the military. Federal authority responds when leverage aligns with geopolitical need. The military becomes one of the first large federal institutions to formally integrate. Meanwhile, Southern resistance hardens. Dixiecrat politicians break from the Democratic Party in 1948, defending segregation openly. Federal enforcement remains cautious. The Supreme Court cases moving through the system will soon converge. By the early 1950s,
Legal groundwork laid by Houston and Marshall reaches its apex in Brown versus Board of Education. But before Brown, there is strategy, gathering social science data, challenging the fiction of equal facilities, exposing funding disparities, demonstrating psychological harm. This is courtroom engineering. The Cold War forces contradiction into visibility. America cannot export democracy while visibly sustaining apartheid-like segregation at home. International optics accelerate domestic reform, but reform remains contested. Media begins playing a new role. Television brings images of protest and violence into living rooms. Narrative control becomes harder. The state must either align practice with rhetoric or endure credibility erosion. Issue 10 reveals a crucial inflection. Civil rights advances are no longer purely moral appeals. They are geopolitical necessities. Executive orders, legal strategies, and military integration occur within the shadow of global scrutiny. The federal government demonstrates that it can act decisively when international image and domestic pressure converge. But integration on paper does not equal compliance on the ground. The stage is set for confrontation, not between abstract ideas, but between federal authority and Southern resistance.
Issue 11. Brown versus Board. Law versus Defiance. By 1954, the legal groundwork laid over decades reaches its apex in Brown versus Board of Education. The question before the Supreme Court is direct. Does segregation in public education violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? For nearly 60 years, Plessy versus Ferguson had legitimized separate but equal. But reality had already exposed the fiction. Facilities were unequal. Funding was unequal. Opportunity was unequal. Yet the Brown strategy does not rely solely on visible disparity. It advances a deeper argument. Segregation itself, even if facilities were equal, generates inherent inequality. Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund present not only constitutional reasoning, but social science evidence. The famous doll studies conducted by Kenneth and Mamie Clark demonstrate psychological harm inflicted on Black children forced into segregated schooling. The argument reframes the battlefield. Segregation damages identity, perception, and civic development. The court responds unanimously. Chief Justice Earl Warren writes that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Plessy collapses in the educational domain. But law on paper is not law in practice. The following year, Brown too introduces the phrase, "with all deliberate speed." This wording becomes strategic ambiguity. Federal authority declares segregation unconstitutional, but provides no immediate enforcement mechanism. Southern states interpret deliberate as delay. Massive resistance begins. Governors vow noncompliance. State legislatures pass interposition resolutions, claiming states' rights to nullify federal rulings. In 1957, Little Rock becomes the test case. When 9 Black students attempt to enter Central High School, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus deploys the National Guard to block them. President Eisenhower ultimately federalizes the Guard and sends the 101st Airborne Division to enforce integration. Federal troops escort children into school. The image is seismic. Military power required to enforce a Supreme Court decision. Throughout the South, white citizens' councils form. Economic intimidation replaces overt mob violence in many regions. Black teachers lose jobs.
School districts close rather than integrate. Public funds are redirected to private segregation academies. Resistance mutates into bureaucratic obstruction. The legal victory becomes a long war of enforcement. Issue 11 reveals a structural truth. Supreme Court rulings can redefine legality, but they cannot automatically re-engineer compliance. Brown dismantles the constitutional shield of segregation. Massive resistance exposes the depth of institutional entrenchment. Federal authority must now choose whether its rulings are symbolic or enforceable. The conflict shifts from courtroom argument to street-level implementation. Law versus defiance. Principle versus power.
Issue 12. Montgomery, The Mathematics of Withdrawal. December 1st, 1955. Rosa Parks refuses to surrender her seat on the Montgomery bus. The act appears simple, but it is not spontaneous chaos. It is structural timing. Parks is trained, respected, strategically positioned. The NAACP had been searching for a case with legal strength and moral clarity. Her arrest becomes ignition, not accident. Within days, local leaders, including a relatively unknown pastor named Martin Luther King Jr., formed the Montgomery Improvement Association. Their strategy is not symbolic protest. It is economic leverage. Montgomery's bus system depends heavily on black ridership. Estimates suggest 65 to 75% of daily passengers are black. That percentage matters. Revenue structure matters. If the majority of paying customers withdraw participation, the system destabilizes. The boycott begins. And it does not last a week. It lasts 381 days. That duration is not emotional outrage. It is disciplined endurance. Carpool systems are engineered with military precision. Volunteer drivers coordinate routes. Churches become dispatch centers. Private vehicles rotate shifts. Walking becomes political statement. The boycott's power lies in mathematics. If X riders withdraw daily at Y fare cost, multiplied over Z months, the financial strain compounds. The city attempts counterpressure, arrests, insurance cancellations, harassment of drivers. Leaders' homes are bombed, yet participation remains high. Media plays a decisive role. Images of orderly black citizens walking miles to work contradict Southern narratives of disorder. National coverage reframes the conflict. The federal courts eventually rule bus segregation unconstitutional in Browder v. Gale, 1956, affirming the boycott's legal objective. Integration of buses follows. But more significant than seating arrangement is the demonstration of economic coordination as a weapon. Montgomery proves something deeper. Political power can be exercised without formal office. Withdrawal of labor, withdrawal of money, withdrawal of compliance. These are levers. When properly organized, they force negotiation. The boycott model becomes template. Sit-ins, freedom rides, Birmingham campaigns. Each builds on the principle that systems collapse when participation collapses. Issue 12 marks a pivot. The movement shifts from courtroom reliance to coordinated public pressure. It fuses moral clarity with economic arithmetic. It demonstrates that nonviolence is not passive. It is strategic disruption. Montgomery is not merely protest. It is proof that disciplined mass withdrawal can bend municipal power. The era of direct action has begun. Issue 13. Birmingham, Fire, Children, and Federal Reckoning. By 1963, The movement has matured beyond isolated victories. Brown has been declared. Montgomery has proven economic leverage, but segregation remains deeply entrenched in southern cities. Birmingham, Alabama, one of the most rigidly segregated cities in America, becomes the next battleground. The local strategy is deliberate. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, alongside local organizers like Fred Shuttlesworth, chooses Birmingham because resistance there will be visible, predictable, and extreme. The objective is no longer quiet persuasion. It is confrontation designed to expose brutality under national cameras. Sit-ins and marches begin. Adults are arrested rapidly. Jails fill. Movement momentum risks stalling. Then, a controversial pivot occurs. The Children's Crusade. High school students march. Teenagers fill the streets. Police Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor responds with fire hoses and police dogs. The force used is not subtle. It is overwhelming. Images are captured. Television changes everything. For the first time, households across America witness children knocked down by water pressure designed to strip bark from trees. They see dogs lunging at unarmed teenagers. They see jail cells filled with minors. The narrative shifts from law and order to moral crisis. International media amplifies the footage. The Cold War optics from Issue 10 now converge with domestic violence. The contradiction becomes undeniable. Behind the scenes, economic pressure again plays a role. Downtown businesses suffer from boycotts. Negotiations begin. Agreements are reached to desegregate certain facilities and hire black employees. But retaliation follows. Bombings target black leaders and churches. Tension escalates further when, later that year, the 16th Street Baptist Church is bombed, killing 4 young girls. National grief turns into legislative urgency. President John F. Kennedy, who had previously moved cautiously, delivers a televised address framing civil rights not merely as a legal issue, but as a moral issue. Federal legislative machinery begins moving toward what will become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The federal government can no longer remain observational. It must legislate decisively or concede moral collapse. Issue 13 marks the point where brutality is televised, where children become the moral mirror of the nation, and where federal hesitation transforms into federal action. Birmingham proves that media exposure combined with disciplined confrontation can accelerate national legislation. The strategy is no longer local disruption. It is national reckoning.
Issue 14. From protest to policy, the architecture of federal power. By 1964, the United States stands at a decision point that has been building for nearly a century. From Reconstruction collapse to Jim Crow enforcement, from Brown's legal declaration to Birmingham's televised brutality, the nation has been forced repeatedly to confront its own contradiction. Now, confrontation becomes codified. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 passes Congress after one of the longest filibusters in Senate history. Its structure is expansive. Title II bans segregation in public accommodations. Title VI prohibits discrimination in federally funded programs. Title VII targets employment discrimination. For the first time since Reconstruction, the federal government asserts broad enforcement authority over private businesses and state institutions. But legislation on paper does not automatically equal access in practice. Voting suppression remains entrenched across the South. Literacy tests, poll taxes, intimidation, arbitrary registration barriers. In 1965, Selma becomes the next pressure point. Marchers attempt to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge demanding voting rights.
State troopers respond with violence. Bloody Sunday is broadcast nationally. Again, media exposure accelerates federal action. President Lyndon B. Johnson addresses Congress declaring, "We shall overcome," aligning executive power with movement demand. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 becomes one of the most powerful pieces of civil rights legislation in American history. It authorizes federal oversight of jurisdictions with histories of discrimination. Literacy tests are suspended. Federal examiners can register voters directly. Within a few years, Black voter registration in many southern states increases dramatically. Political representation begins to shift. This is the structural pivot. The movement transitions from reactive protest to institutional access. Federal power is no longer merely symbolic, it becomes regulatory. Enforcement mechanisms matter. Oversight matters. Data collection matters. The architecture of citizenship expands. Yet new resistance patterns form. Suburbanization accelerates. Economic disparities persist. Redlining continues to shape wealth distribution. The struggle does not end. It evolves. Issue 14 does not conclude the narrative. It reveals the mechanics of how protest transforms into statute, how moral urgency becomes enforceable law, how federal authority can be expanded under sufficient pressure and visibility. It demonstrates that sustained organizing, economic leverage, legal engineering, and media exposure, when aligned, can restructure national policy. From constitutional contradiction to federal enforcement, the 14-issue arc reveals a system under stress that only moves when forced. Change is not spontaneous. It is engineered. And once engineered, it must be defended.
Epilogue. After enforcement, the second battlefield. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 did not end resistance. They altered its architecture. Overt segregation became administratively unacceptable, but systems do not disappear. They adapt. As public accommodations opened, capital quietly migrated. Suburbanization accelerated. Highway construction divided urban cores. Redlining maps, already institutionalized through federal housing policy, calcified wealth divergence across generations. The most powerful wealth-building instrument in modern America, home equity, expanded unevenly. The gap compounded over decades, not headlines. In the 1970s and 1980s, policy language shifted from explicit exclusion to crime management. Mandatory minimums, sentencing disparities, and aggressive drug enforcement produced disproportionate incarceration rates. Again, the mechanism was procedural, not theatrical. No signage, no whites-only placards, just legislation, enforcement discretion, and statistical concentration. The battlefield moved from school doors and bus seats to courtrooms and zoning boards. In 2013, key provisions of the Voting Rights Act were weakened by Supreme Court decisions. Federal oversight requirements were reduced. Within years, voting access debates re-emerged across multiple states. History did not repeat. It reconfigured. The form changed. The tension remained. Media evolved again. In Birmingham, brutality required television cameras. In the digital era, documentation is instantaneous. But virality does not automatically equal reform. Algorithms amplify outrage. Policy requires engineering. The lesson of the previous 14 issues remains consistent.
Change occurs when moral clarity aligns with economic leverage, legal precision, federal authority, and disciplined organization. Remove one element, and progress slows. Remove several, and regression accelerates. The second battlefield is structural literacy. Understanding zoning laws, understanding budget allocations, understanding judicial appointments, understanding how data shapes policy, understanding how economic participation can be coordinated. Because modern inequality hides in complexity, and complexity favors the informed. To honor Black history every day is not to repeat slogans. It is to study mechanisms. The arc from slavery to federal enforcement proves that citizenship expands only under sustained pressure combined with strategic design. Every generation inherits both victories and vulnerabilities. The task is not to romanticize prior struggle. The task is to refine it. Power evolves, so must memory. And memory, when structured, becomes blueprint. The first battlefield was visibility. The second is systems. The future belongs to those who understand both.